What if the people closest to you vanished after a simple family dinner, and no one wanted to find out why? It began on a fog-drenched November night, 1998, when the Ross family failed to arrive home after Thanksgiving dinner. Cedar Hollow, Oregon had seen its share of tragedies, logging accidents, the occasional drowning, but nothing like this. A family of four, gone. Vanished between one point and another on a 17-mile stretch of winding mountain road. By mid-morning the next day, Evelyn's sister, Margaret, called the Ross house to check in. No answer. At first, she brushed it off. Maybe they stayed overnight somewhere. The roads were bad. But by afternoon, unease set in. Their car, a faded blue station wagon with a dent in the rear bumper, was nowhere to be found. The neighbors hadn't seen headlights past the old sawmill road that night. The Ross mailbox remained untouched. Dinner dishes still sat in Margaret's farmhouse sink from the night before, remnants of a family gathering that now felt eerily distant. "I figured they'd just call when they got home," Margaret would later tell investigators. She paused then, eyes distant. But when the phone stayed quiet all morning, I don't know. Something just felt wrong. There was no formal alarm at first, just a creeping feeling that something wasn't right. Calls went to voicemail. Thomas's pager blinked without response. And as the fog thickened and rain began to fall, that silence took on a new kind of weight, the kind that doesn't just suggest absence, but erasure. By midnight, Thomas's brother filed a missing persons report. Sheriff Leland Monroe took down the details with a measured calm that would later haunt him. Thomas Ross, 42, Evelyn Ross, 39, Harper Ross, 12, Ben Ross, 9. Last seen leaving the Whitaker farmhouse around 10:15 p.m. Thanksgiving night. Weather conditions, heavy fog, intermittent rain. It would be the last quiet night Cedar Hollow knew for decades. "People go missing every day," Monroe told reporters a week later. "But families don't. Not like this. Not without leaving something behind." The disappearance seemed impossible in its completeness. A blue 1992 Volvo station wagon with 4 souls inside had driven into the fog and simply ceased to exist. No tire tracks veering off-road, no crashed guardrail, no calls for help. The town held its collective breath, waiting for the logical explanation that never came. For days, volunteers combed the roads between Margaret's farmhouse and the Ross residence, a 2-story craftsman on Pinecrest Drive. Sheriff's deputies scoured ravines with flashlights. Rain turned the dirt roads to rivers of mud. Tire tracks and footprints vanished beneath the flow. "We started with the obvious," Deputy Chris Harmon recalled 20 years later. "Car trouble. Maybe they pulled over, couldn't get reception, decided to walk to get help. But there were no footprints anywhere along the shoulders. And in that mud? There should have been something." The search expanded. Helicopters swept the dense forest canopy. Cadaver dogs searched creek beds and thickets. Nothing. By December, the county had exhausted its resources. The case remained open, but inactive. Cedar Hollow returned to its routines. Christmas lights went up. School resumed. People spoke in hushed tones about the Ross family, always in past tense. And then something strange happened. Cedar Hollow began to forget. Not all at once, but in pieces. The Ross family's absence became normal. Their house was sold in early 2000, their possessions packed away by distant relatives. Their story became local legend, a cautionary tale about driving in fog or taking hollow path after dark. People stopped looking, stopped asking, until 2023 when the forest finally gave back what it took. By morning, the Ross family's absence was no longer an oversight. It was a mystery. And before the end of that week, Cedar Hollow would realize this wasn't just about a family that vanished. It was about a truth buried deeper than anyone dared to dig. The last time you see someone matters, Dr. Claudia Fernandez, forensic psychologist, explains. Our brains are pattern recognition machines. They notice tiny details we're not consciously processing: micro expressions, body language, unusual behavior patterns. That's why so many people report feeling something was off during their final interaction with someone who later meets harm. The last night the Ross family was seen followed this pattern perfectly. Thanksgiving evening at Margaret Whittaker's farmhouse was, by all accounts, ordinary. Warm light spilled from windows into the fog. Laughter, conversation, the smell of roasted turkey, and Margaret's famous sweet potato pie. Extended family gathered in the dining room, where a fire crackled in the old stone hearth, casting long shadows across the knotted pine floor. But beneath this Norman Rockwell facade, something was off-kilter. Evelyn Ross was quiet, distracted. She picked at her food and checked her watch repeatedly. Her husband Thomas smiled and joked with relatives, but his laughter never quite reached his eyes. He refused wine with dinner, saying he needed a clear head for the drive home. Their daughter Harper, 12, and already showing her mother's artistic talent, sensed the tension. She nudged mashed potatoes around her plate and stared at the condensation forming on the dining room windows. Her younger brother Ben, 9 and oblivious, hummed along to Christmas music, playing softly from the stereo. Looking back, there were signs, Margaret told Detective Henry Calder in 2023. The way Evelyn kept her purse on her shoulder throughout dinner, like she was ready to bolt. How Thomas pulled me aside to say he'd left something in my garage. A Christmas present he didn't want Evelyn to see. But he never went to the garage, just stood on the porch, smoking, watching the road. Margaret remembers a truck, black, with tinted windows, parked briefly outside. Its headlights cut through the fog before turning back toward town. When she mentioned it to Thomas, he changed the subject. Around 10 p.m., the Ross family prepared to leave. The kids pulled on coats. Thomas helped Evelyn with her scarf. There was nothing overtly alarming about their departure, just small details that would later haunt those who witnessed them. Evelyn hugged me goodbye, Margaret recalled, her voice breaking even decades later. It wasn't just a hug, it was longer, tighter, and when she pulled back, she had this look, like she wanted to say something important. Instead, she just said, "I'll call you tomorrow." But she never did. This uneasy goodbye isn't unique to the Ross case. In the disappearance of the McStay family in 2010, security footage showed Joseph McStay making 3 trips to his car before the family's final departure. Unusual behavior that investigators later determined was him moving documents he'd hidden from view. The Jamison family's 2009 disappearance similarly featured odd behaviors on their last seen day, loading their truck with unexpected items, appearing disoriented on security cameras. These behavioral anomalies often represent someone operating under duress, explains former FBI behavioral analyst Robert Mendez. They're trying to maintain normalcy while preparing for something they know is coming. It's a survival mechanism. For the Ross family, other warning signs emerged in hindsight. Thomas had received a letter earlier that day. His co-worker at Cedar Hollow Savings and Loan, Linda Prescott, remembered a courier delivering an envelope marked "personal" around noon. He read it at his desk, then read it again in the bathroom. When he came back, he'd torn it into tiny pieces. I found him shredding the remains after hours. Harper had left her favorite backpack at her aunt's house, something the meticulous preteen would never do accidentally. Inside was her diary, containing entries that would later provide crucial context. Dad keeps saying everything's fine, but he and Mom are whispering again. When I ask what's wrong, they change the subject. Something's happening. Ben had drawn a picture at school the week before, a dark figure standing near their house. When his teacher asked about it, he said, "That's the man who watches us sleep." The drawing was filed away as typical childhood imagination. By the time the Ross family's taillights disappeared into the fog, multiple small warnings had been missed. Their fate was already in motion. We focus on dramatic warning signs in hindsight, says Dr. Fernandez. The arguing couple, the explicit threat. But reality is subtler. It's the silence where conversation should be, the hug that lingers too long, the eyes that can't quite meet yours. And for the Ross family, the warnings continued right up until they disappeared into the night. Their car pulled away from Margaret's farmhouse at 10:15 p.m. Several guests noted that Thomas took the main road toward town instead of the direct route home, a decision that initially seemed insignificant. He said the fog was too thick on the back roads, Margaret remembered, but Thomas knew those roads better than anyone. He'd grown up here. What no one realized was that the forest they drove into wasn't empty. It was waiting. By Friday morning, 48 hours after the Ross family had vanished, Cedar Hollow transformed into a search headquarters. Volunteers gathered at the fire station, assigned to grids along the 17-mile route between Margaret's farmhouse and the Ross residence. Sheriff's deputies coordinated with state police. Rain continued to fall, turning dirt roads into rivers of mud. It was the worst possible conditions for a search, remembers Deputy Chris Harmon. 40-degree rain, fog so thick you couldn't see 30 feet ahead. And the terrain? Ravines, logging roads, old mining trails. A car could be 20 feet off the main road and completely invisible. The search teams found their first clue around noon, a partial tire track leading onto an unmarked logging path locals called Hollow Path. The road had been officially closed since a landslide in the late 1980s, but locals still used it as a shortcut, including Thomas Ross. That track was fresh, Harmon said, but with the rain, we couldn't get a clear impression, just enough to know someone had turned there recently. 3 hours later, another discovery. Red glass shards at a sharp curve, later identified as fragments from a reflector matching the Ross family's Volvo station wagon. These shards were found approximately 2 miles down Hollow Path, suggesting the family had indeed taken the abandoned shortcut. It didn't make sense, Sheriff Monroe told reporters. Thomas knew that road was dangerous in good conditions, let alone in fog. Why take it? Unless he was in a hurry, or unless someone forced him to. This theory gained credibility when a gas station clerk in Millerville, 8 miles from Margaret's house, reported seeing a car matching the Ross family's description at 10:45 p.m. on Thanksgiving night. The detail that stood out, one broken headlight. The driver looked nervous, clerk Danny Simmons reported. Kept glancing in his rearview mirror. Woman in the passenger seat was crying. I remember thinking they might be having car trouble, but they didn't stop. Despite these breadcrumbs, the search hit a wall. Hollow Path eventually splits into 5 different logging trails, each winding deeper into national forest land. By Sunday, rain had washed away any remaining tracks. The search area expanded to over 200 square miles of dense woodland. The Ross family seemed to have simply evaporated into the forest. It's not uncommon in rural regions, says search and rescue coordinator Melanie Chen. Nature becomes an accomplice to disappearance. Rain erases tracks. Fog obscures visibility. Distance isolates. In the Tillamook State Forest cases from the 1980s, 3 separate groups vanished within a 5-year period. In each case, weather conditions degraded evidence before rescuers could find them. For 5 days, helicopters and drones scanned the area. Cadaver dogs tracked scents that disappeared into creeks. Thermal imaging detected nothing but deer and the occasional bear. The forest keeps its secrets, local guide Jim Redding observed grimly. Sometimes for years, sometimes forever. With every step deeper into the fog, the Ross family's trail grew colder. But Hollow Path had not been chosen by accident, and soon the significance of that forgotten road would emerge from the shadows of Cedar Hollow's past. In missing persons investigations, the smallest details often become the most significant, explains former homicide detective Marcus Brennan. Not because they're dramatic, but because they're specific. They cut through assumptions and reveal patterns of behavior that tell us who someone really was and what might have happened to them. For the Ross family, one such detail was a broken headlight. The gas station clerk's observation initially seemed minor, a blue station wagon with a cracked left headlight. But when investigators interviewed the family's mechanic, Rick Dawson, at Cedar Hollow Auto, this detail took on new meaning. Thomas brought that car in 3 times in November, Dawson confirmed, consulting his service records. Each time for the same issue, electrical system, specifically the left headlight. I replaced the bulb twice, but the problem was deeper, faulty wiring harness. I told him it needed a proper fix, especially with winter coming. He kept putting it off. This revelation puzzled investigators. Thomas Ross was known for his meticulousness. His desk at work was immaculate. His lawn was the neatest on Pinecrest Drive. Why would he repeatedly ignore a safety issue? The last time he came in was November 20th, Dawson continued. I warned him directly, Thomas, driving at night in the fog with one headlight is dangerous. He just shrugged and said, "It'll hold." That seemingly minor negligence became crucial to the timeline. Multiple witnesses reported seeing a vehicle with one headlight along different segments of the route that night. At 10:52 p.m., a truck driver saw such a car turning onto Hollow Path. But because investigators initially sought a car with 2 functioning headlights, this sighting was dismissed. It cost us days, Deputy Harmon admitted. We were looking for the wrong thing because we assumed Thomas would have fixed the headlight. We didn't account for behavioral changes. This pattern, ignoring small but critical safety issues, appears in other missing persons cases. In 2002, the Mather family disappeared in rural Vermont after their car, with a broken taillight, was mistaken for a different vehicle. The 3-day delay in identifying their correct route resulted in tragedy. By the time searchers found their crashed car off a mountain road, exposure had claimed 2 lives. For Detective Henry Calder, then only 3 years into his career, the headlight became a metaphor for the investigation itself, a blind spot, a literal darkness concealing the truth. I keep thinking about that headlight, Calder told his partner during the initial search. Thomas was hiding something. You don't just ignore warnings like that unless you've got bigger concerns. Those bigger concerns began to surface as investigators dug deeper into the family's final weeks. Thomas had withdrawn $7,500 from their savings account on November 15th. Evelyn had quietly transferred her personal papers to a safety deposit box on the 17th. Harper had suddenly quit the school choir, telling friends she might be moving soon. These actions, combined with the neglected headlight, painted a disturbing picture, a family preparing for something they couldn't discuss openly. It's strange how something so small, a single bulb, a single choice, can change the course of 5 lives, Calder would later write in his case notes. But this broken headlight wasn't the only thing hiding in the dark. As the investigation continued, the headlight became a symbol of all the warning signs people had missed, or chosen to ignore, about the Ross family situation. It represented the literal darkness that had swallowed them on Hollow Path and the figurative darkness that had been closing in long before Thanksgiving night. But time was working against the investigation. The first 48 hours after a disappearance are crucial, and for the Ross family, most of that window had already closed before anyone realized they were missing. The worst part of a disappearance isn't the moment someone vanishes, says Delia Martinez, founder of the Missing in America project. It's the hours and days when they exist in limbo, when they're gone, but not officially missing, when everyone is making excuses instead of taking action. That's when cases are lost. For the Ross family, those crucial waiting hours stretched from Friday morning until Sunday afternoon, nearly 60 hours during which no official search took place. When Thomas, Evelyn, Harper, and Ben failed to return home Thursday night, No immediate alarm was raised. Evelyn's sister Margaret assumed they'd stayed at a hotel due to the weather. Thomas's co-workers at Cedar Hollow Savings and Loan expected him to call in sick after the holiday. Harper's best friend Jenny waited for a call that never came about their planned Black Friday shopping trip. Everyone had a rational explanation for the silence. The roads were terrible that night, Margaret told herself. They probably couldn't make it all the way home. Thomas mentioned he might take Friday off, his supervisor recalled. I didn't think anything of it when he didn't show. I figured Harper forgot about our plans, Jenny said. She'd been acting weird all week anyway. Each person held a piece of the puzzle, but didn't recognize its importance. By the time Margaret finally contacted authorities on Sunday morning, she could tell by the dispatcher's tone that it was already too late to recover much evidence. I waited too long, Margaret admitted, her voice breaking. I didn't want to believe they were gone. I kept thinking they'd call any minute with a perfectly normal explanation. This delay proved catastrophic for the investigation. Rain had washed away tire marks and footprints. The scent trail for search dogs had dissipated. Witnesses' memories had begun to blur. Time is the enemy in these cases, explained Sheriff Monroe. Every hour that passes, we lose physical evidence. Rain, wind, animals, decomposition. Nature erases the truth faster than we can find it. The waiting period revealed something else about Cedar Hollow, a town-wide tendency toward denial. When interviewed later, multiple neighbors admitted they'd noticed strange vehicles near the Ross home in the weeks before Thanksgiving. A UPS driver recalled delivering an unusual number of packages marked personal to Thomas's office. Harper's teacher observed the girl had stopped completing homework assignments. No one connected these dots until it was too late. Communities like to preserve their sense of safety, explains sociologist Dr. Amelia Wheaton. Acknowledging that a family might be in danger means acknowledging danger exists in your town, on your street. It's easier to assume everything is fine. This collective blind spot appears frequently in rural disappearances. In the 2013 Collier family case in Montana, neighbors later admitted seeing the father loading bags into their car at 3 a.m., but didn't report it because they didn't want to pry. The family's remains were found 6 months later. For Cedar Hollow, the waiting hours revealed an uncomfortable truth. The community had chosen comfort over vigilance. They'd heard the silence, but interpreted it as peace. By the time the search officially began, Cedar Hollow's forest had already buried its secret, but 25 years later, the forest would give it back. On May 18, 2023, Alex Mercer, a 32-year-old wildlife photographer, ventured into a restricted section of Cedar Hollow's national forest land. Spring rain had made the moss glow an impossible green. Sunlight filtered through towering pines. He was tracking a family of foxes when he stumbled upon something out of place, a splash of faded blue amid the undergrowth. At first I thought it was garbage, Mercer recalls. Some old tarp or plastic. Then I saw metal, rusted, twisted metal, and I realized I was looking at a car. What Mercer discovered was the Ross family's 1992 Volvo station wagon, or what remained of it. 25 years of Oregon weather had not been kind. The vehicle was half swallowed by earth and vegetation, its windows shattered, driver's side door bent inward at an unnatural angle. Rust had consumed most of the exterior. Roots had grown through the undercarriage, anchoring it to the forest floor like an ancient artifact. Mercer called authorities immediately. Within hours, the area was cordoned off as a crime scene. Sheriff's Department investigators confirmed the vehicle identification number within 24 hours. It was indeed the missing Ross family car. It was roughly 2.8 miles off Hollow Path, explains current Sheriff Diana Reeves, in an area we searched back in '98. But the vehicle had gone down a ravine and was obscured by dense vegetation. Even from 20 feet away, it would have been nearly invisible back then. The recovery operation took 3 days. Inside the vehicle, Investigators found remnants of a family frozen in time. Scraps of fabric later identified as Harper's favorite coat, a corroded watch belonging to Thomas, fragments of bones scattered throughout the interior, and under the passenger seat, something untouched by time, a rusted metal lunchbox containing a water-stained note written in childlike handwriting. Mom said we can't tell anyone. Dad's scared. Please help us. The note was dated November 8, 1998, nearly 3 weeks before the family's disappearance. That note changed everything, says Detective Marcus Chen, who led the 2023 investigation. It wasn't just about a family having an accident on a foggy night anymore. It was about a family in crisis, one that had been silently crying for help long before they vanished. Forensic examination of the vehicle revealed other crucial details. The car hadn't simply veered off the road in poor visibility. Impact patterns showed it had been struck from behind and the passenger side, forced off the road deliberately. Metal fragments embedded in the rear bumper contained paint traces from another vehicle, black paint consistent with a truck or SUV. The driver's side window hadn't been shattered by the crash but appeared to have been broken from outside. What we found wasn't consistent with an accident, explains forensic analyst Teresa Huang. The damage patterns suggest multiple points of impact at different angles, consistent with a vehicle being deliberately run off the road. Most telling was the location itself. The car rested at the bottom of a steep ravine, invisible from both air and ground searches. It wasn't on any logical route between Margaret's farmhouse and the Ross residence. It was, as Sheriff Reeves put it, somewhere you'd only go if you were trying to disappear, or if someone wanted you to disappear. The discovery sent shockwaves through Cedar Hollow. Many current residents had never heard of the Ross family. Their story had faded into local legend over the decades. For others, particularly those who'd participated in the original search, the discovery reopened old wounds. I drove past that spot hundreds of times, former Deputy Chris Harmon said, his voice thick with emotion. We all did. They were right there, and we couldn't see them. The forensic evidence, particularly the note, raised more questions than it answered. Who had the Ross family feared? What had Thomas been hiding? Why had they taken Hollow Path that night despite knowing its dangers? With one discovery, the silence of 25 years shattered. But the note inside that car raised more questions than it answered, and pointed to someone who had never truly left Cedar Hollow. Marissa Cobb was 16 when her Aunt Evelyn, Uncle Thomas, and cousins disappeared. Now 41 and working as an investigative journalist specializing in cold cases, she'd built a career turning personal tragedy into purpose. When news of the discovered vehicle reached her Portland apartment, she didn't cry. She packed a bag. I always knew they'd be found eventually, she told her editor at Northwest Investigative Journal. I just didn't expect to still be alive when it happened. Cedar Hollow had changed in the decades since the Ross family vanished. The lumber mill had closed. New housing developments sprawled where Forest once stood, but Main Street retained its small-town character. The hardware store, the diner, the movie theater, with its vintage marquee. Marissa's first stop wasn't the recovery site or the sheriff's office. It was a small craftsman house on Elm Street, home to Henry Calder, now retired after 30 years with the Cedar Hollow Sheriff's Department. Calder, 68, recognized her immediately. You've got Evelyn's eyes, he said, ushering her inside. His living room walls displayed the evidence of a career in law enforcement, photographs, commendations, newspaper clippings, and in the center, a corkboard dedicated to one case, the Ross family. I never stopped, Calder explained, pouring coffee with slightly trembling hands, even after I retired. Something about this case, it never felt right. What Calder shared that afternoon would fundamentally alter the investigation. From a locked drawer he retrieved a notebook, his personal case file containing observations and leads that never made it into official reports. There was a name that kept coming up, he said, flipping through yellowed pages. Someone who had financial ties to Thomas but was conspicuously never interviewed. Dean Merrow. Dean Merrow had been a real estate agent and loan officer at Cedar Valley Mortgage, a competitor to Thomas Ross's employer. Records showed complex financial entanglements between the two men: property deals, joint investments, and personal loans totaling over $120,000. Thomas was moving money around in the weeks before Thanksgiving, Calder continued. Withdrawals, account transfers, safety deposit boxes, classic preparation behavior. Marissa recognized the name immediately. Dean Merrow. He came to our house for dinner once. I remember because Thomas and Evelyn argued about it afterward. She didn't like him. When Marissa asked why this connection wasn't pursued in 1998, Calder's expression darkened. Politics, he said simply. Merrow's father was on the county board. His uncle was state police. Questions about him were discouraged. Most significantly, Calder revealed that phone records, which he'd obtained unofficially, showed multiple calls between Merrow's home phone and Evelyn Ross's cell phone on Thanksgiving Day, including one at 9:27 p.m., less than an hour before the family left Margaret's house. I always suspected Evelyn was planning to leave Thomas, Calder said. The separate bank account, the document transfers, classic signs. But something went wrong that night. Armed with Calder's notes and her journalist's credentials, Marissa approached the current investigation team, led by Detective Marcus Chen. Her timing was perfect. Forensic analysis had just identified a partial fingerprint preserved inside the metal lunchbox that held Harper's note. The print matched Dean Merrow. The fingerprint was preserved because the lunchbox created a microclimate, explained forensic specialist Huang. The metal oxidized in a way that actually preserved the oils from the print. 25 years later, we had enough for a match. This evidence transformed the investigation. Dean Merrow was no longer just a person of interest, but a prime suspect. But there was a complication. Merrow had died in 2017 after a battle with pancreatic cancer. Just because the suspect is dead doesn't mean the case is closed, Detective Chen assured Marissa. The Ross family deserves answers, even if there's no one left to prosecute. The investigation intensified. Merrow's former residence was searched. Financial records were subpoenaed. Former associates were interviewed. A picture began to emerge of a man whose charming exterior had concealed darker impulses. Dean had a temper, his former secretary revealed, especially when things didn't go his way, and he was obsessed with the Ross family, had their address written in his day planner, circled in red. Most significantly, records showed Merrow had owned a black Ford F-150 in 1998, a vehicle that matched paint traces found on the Ross family's car. That truck had been reported stolen 3 days after Thanksgiving and was later found burned in a quarry 50 miles away. For Marissa, these revelations brought conflicting emotions. Part of me was relieved to finally have answers, she says. Another part was furious that this man had been walking around free all those years, while my family was buried in the woods. The 2023 discovery had reframed the story completely. What had once seemed like a tragic accident, a family lost in fog on a dangerous road, now appeared to be something far more sinister, deliberate, premeditated, and covered up for decades. But as Marissa and the investigators would soon discover, the conspiracy extended beyond one man. The truth had been hiding in plain sight all along, protected by a community that preferred comfortable lies to difficult truths. The dead can't speak, but they leave echoes for those willing to listen. And now, for the first time in 25 years, those echoes had begun to sound like confession. As Marissa delved deeper into the rediscovered case, she uncovered something more disturbing than one man's crime, a town-wide pattern of silence. It wasn't just that Dean Merrow threatened my family, Marissa explains. It's that people knew and said nothing. Their silence made them complicit. Through dozens of interviews with longtime Cedar Hollow residents, a troubling picture emerged of a community that had chosen willful blindness over uncomfortable action. Linda McKenzie, who lived across from the Ross family, admitted seeing Dean Merrow's truck parked outside their house multiple times in November 1998, sometimes past midnight. "I thought maybe he and Thomas were working on some deal," she said. "It wasn't my business to pry." Robert Jenkins, Thomas's co-worker, recalled overhearing an argument between Thomas and Merrow 3 days before Thanksgiving. Dean was saying something about payment schedules, how Thomas had run out of extensions. Thomas looked terrified. "I asked if he needed help and he just said, 'Stay out of it, Bob. For your own good.'" Even Sheriff Monroe, now retired and living in Arizona, acknowledged systemic failures. Cedar Hollow was different back then. Tight-knit, sure, but that had a dark side. People protected their own. Merrow's family had pull. Asking too many questions about him wasn't good for a career in local law enforcement. Most revealing was Marissa's interview with Pastor David Wilson, who had counseled Thomas and Evelyn in the weeks before their disappearance. Thomas confessed he'd borrowed heavily from Merrow for real estate investments, Wilson admitted reluctantly. When the market turned, he couldn't repay. Merrow started threatening the family, subtle at first, then more directly. Thomas wanted to go to the police, but Merrow's connections made that risky. "Why didn't you come forward after they disappeared?" Marissa asked. The pastor's response was telling. "Confidentiality and fear, I suppose." Dean was still here. His family still had influence. It seemed safer to assume the Ross family had simply left town. This collective silence had enabled not just the original crime, but its decades-long concealment. Cedar Hollow had maintained its self-image as a safe, wholesome community by burying uncomfortable truths, both figuratively and literally. "It's not unique to Cedar Hollow," explained sociologist Dr. Amelia Wheaton. "Small communities often develop informal codes of conduct that prioritize stability over justice. Speaking out becomes seen as disruptive, even traitorous. This conspiracy of silence appears in numerous high-profile disappearances. The Springfield Seven in 1992, the Dalton family in 2005. In each case, multiple people held pieces of critical information but didn't come forward until years later. For Marissa, the town's role became as important as Merrow's. "This isn't just about a bad man doing a terrible thing," she told Detective Chen. "It's about how a whole community becomes complicit through silence." As the investigation continued, this silence began to crack. People who had held secrets for decades finally spoke. Thomas's supervisor admitted knowing about threatening phone calls Merrow made to the office. A bank teller confirmed Evelyn had been quietly transferring funds to an account in her maiden name. Preparation to flee. Harper's teacher revealed the girl had written an alarming essay about the man who watches our house at night, but had dismissed it as creative fiction. Each confession revealed how close the truth had always been, hidden not by clever deception, but by collective denial. Cedar Hollow became a character in itself, the archetype of willful blindness. Everyone had held a piece of truth, but never shared it, fearing judgment or disruption. That collective inaction had allowed the lie to live, and the Ross family to die unseen. The truth wasn't just hidden in the woods, it was hidden in people's hearts. But Marissa's search wasn't over yet. There was still one unanswered question. What happened inside that car before it left the road? On October 15, 2023, nearly 5 months after the discovery of the Ross family's vehicle, investigators completed their forensic reconstruction of the night of November 26, 1998. Using advanced trajectory modeling, DNA evidence, and witness statements collected across 25 years, they pieced together the family's final hours. The timeline revealed a carefully orchestrated trap. 9:27 p.m., Thanksgiving night, Dean Marrow calls Evelyn Ross. Though the content of their conversation remains unknown, cell tower data places Marrow's phone near Margaret Whitaker's farmhouse at this time. 10:15 p.m., the Ross family leaves Thanksgiving dinner. Thomas takes the main road toward town instead of the direct route home, likely already aware of the danger. 10:33 p.m., security footage from Cedar Hollow Credit Union, discovered in their archive during the renewed investigation, shows a black Ford F-150 following a blue station wagon through town. 10:45 p.m., gas station clerk Danny Simmons observes the Ross family's car with one broken headlight. Thomas appears nervous. Evelyn is crying. 10:52 p.m. A truck driver sees a car with one headlight turn onto Hollow Path, a shortcut that Thomas would normally avoid, especially in fog. 10:57, 11:10 p.m. estimated. Based on vehicle damage patterns, the Ross family's car is repeatedly struck by a larger vehicle, forcing it off Hollow Path and down a ravine. What happened next required forensic anthropology to reconstruct. Evidence suggests the family survived the initial crash. Harper's coat was found 20 feet from the vehicle. Thomas's watch was discovered near the driver's door. Blood spatter patterns indicate movement throughout the car after impact. They were alive after the crash, confirms forensic anthropologist Dr. Eleanor Soto. But the vehicle was severely damaged in a remote location during freezing weather. Without immediate rescue, their chances of survival were minimal. Most revealing was the discovery of boot prints preserved in clay beneath years of leaf litter near the crash site. These prints matched the size and tread pattern of work boots purchased by Dean Marrow 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, receipts for which were found among his personal effects. He visited the site, Detective Chen concludes. Whether to confirm they couldn't escape or for some other purpose, we can't be certain. But he was there. The physical evidence, combined with Harper's note and financial records, tells a story of premeditated violence. Thomas Ross had borrowed heavily from Dean Marrow for real estate investments. When those investments failed in the 1998 market downturn, Thomas couldn't repay. Marrow, facing his own financial troubles, began threatening the family. Evelyn, aware of the danger, had begun preparing to leave, transferring documents and funds to secure locations. Harper's note confirms the family's fear and their attempts to keep it hidden from others. On Thanksgiving night, after months of threats and preparations, something forced their hand. The timing of Marrow's call suggests an ultimatum. Thomas's decision to take the main road through town instead of the back way home indicates an attempt to stay in public view as long as possible, but eventually, whether through further threats or direct pursuit, they ended up on Hollow Path, isolated, vulnerable, and ultimately trapped. This wasn't a random accident or a family running from debts, Marissa wrote in her investigative piece for Northwest Investigative Journal. This was a calculated act of violence, preceded by months of intimidation and followed by decades of silence. The forensic mapping provided answers but no comfort. It confirmed the Ross family had been pursued, forced off the road, and left to die in freezing conditions miles from help. Thomas and Evelyn likely survived the initial crash but succumbed to injuries and exposure. Harper's remains showed evidence of having moved away from the vehicle before collapsing. Ben, the youngest, appears to have died upon impact. The forest preserved not just their remains but the truth of what happened to them, Detective Chen observed solemnly. Nature doesn't take sides or keep secrets, it just waits. For Cedar Hollow, the reconstruction forced a community-wide reckoning. The comfortable narrative of a tragic accident dissolved, replaced by the harder truth. A family had been murdered, and the town had been complicit in hiding that fact for 25 years. Clarity had arrived, but peace felt hollow. The truth was colder than the fog that had shrouded Hollow Path that Thanksgiving night. The Ross family hadn't vanished. They'd been silenced. And yet, even in silence, they left behind the words no one could erase. On November 26, 2023, exactly 25 years after the Ross family disappeared, Cedar Hollow gathered for a memorial. A small stone marker was placed near the entrance to Hollow Path. Simple bronze letters read, Thomas, Evelyn, Harper, and Ben Ross. Lost November 26, 1998, found May 18, 2023. Truth endures longer than silence. The ceremony drew hundreds, including original search volunteers, current investigators, and relatives who had spent decades wondering. Margaret Whitaker, now 81, placed 4 white roses against the stone. Marissa Cobb stood beside her, supporting her aunt's trembling frame. "I never thought I'd live to see this day," Margaret whispered. "To finally know." Sheriff Diana Reeves formally closed the case file that afternoon, classifying the deaths as homicides with Dean Merrow as the perpetrator. Though Merrow had died in 2017, forensic evidence, financial records, and witness testimonies provided what Reeves called conclusive proof of his guilt. For Marissa, the ceremony marked both an ending and a beginning. Her investigation had done more than solve a cold case. It had exposed the dangers of collective silence. "What happened to my family wasn't just one man's crime," she told the assembled crowd. "It was enabled by a community that chose comfort over truth. We owe them more than remembrance. We owe them a promise to never let silence protect the wrong people again." In the weeks following the memorial, Cedar Hollow experienced what sociologists call truth reconciliation, a community-wide process of acknowledging complicity and seeking forgiveness. People who had withheld information came forward. Old suspicions were finally voiced. The town began the difficult work of rebuilding itself around honesty rather than comfortable denial. As winter settled over Cedar Hollow, Marissa completed her documentary piece for Northwest Investigative Journal. Titled The Silence After Thanksgiving, it chronicled not just the Ross family's fate, but the 25-year conspiracy of silence that had hidden it. The article won national attention and prompted similar cold case reviews across the country. In her concluding paragraphs, Marissa wrote, "Sometimes we think silence protects us, but silence was what buried them. The truth isn't loud. It whispers, waiting for someone brave enough to hear." My aunt, uncle, and cousins drove into the fog on Thanksgiving night, surrounded by danger that everyone sensed but no one named. Their story isn't unique. In homes and towns across America, people are disappearing into metaphorical fog right now. Their warning signs ignored, their fears dismissed, their absence explained away. The disappearance of the Ross family wasn't born from darkness. It was built piece by piece, one ignored sign at a time. Because truth doesn't hide in shadows. It hides in our refusal to see. As snow fell on Cedar Hollow that December, covering Hollow Path in white silence, the forest stood unchanged, patient, ancient, indifferent to human tragedy. The pines that had witnessed the Ross family's final moments continued their slow growth, adding another ring to mark another year past. But something had shifted in Cedar Hollow itself. The silence after Thanksgiving had finally been broken. And in that breaking, something new had begun to grow. A community willing to face uncomfortable truths, to name dangers before they claim lives, to recognize that real safety comes not from denial, but from vigilance. The marker near Hollow Path gathered snow, its bronze letters momentarily hidden beneath white. But beneath the snow, the truth remained, enduring longer than silence, waiting for spring to reveal it once more. In memory, they were no longer lost.